At 2:17 a.m. on December 14, 1944, Captain Frank Hayes crouched in frozen mud along the western edge of the Hürtgen Forest in Germany, watching 6,000 exhausted infantrymen prepare for a march that would either save them all or get every single one of them killed. The temperature was 19 degrees. His boots were frozen solid. He could see his breath in the darkness, each exhale a potential death sentence, because German listening posts were less than 400 yards away. Hayes was 31 years old. He'd been in the Hürtgen for 5 months. In that time, he'd watched his battalion lose 73% of its original strength to artillery, machine guns, and frontal assaults against positions that couldn't be taken. Now division had given him an order that was functionally a suicide mission. Attack straight into 12 Panzer divisions dug into the hills east of their position. Hayes had a different plan. An unauthorized plan, a plan that would either end the stalemate or end his career. He checked his watch again. 2:18 a.m. In 7 minutes, they were moving. Frank Hayes grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood where every father worked at the Bethlehem steel plant. His dad was a foreman. His older brother worked the blast furnace. Frank was supposed to follow them, but he joined the Army in 1936 instead, figuring it was steadier work than the mills. He was 23 then. Now he was 31, a captain in the 28th Infantry Division, and he'd been in combat since Normandy. He wasn't a West Point graduate. He wasn't from a military family. He was a Steeltown kid who'd worked his way up through 8 years of peacetime Army before the war turned him into something else entirely. Hayes had arrived at the Hürtgen Forest in early November 1944. The forest was a nightmare. Dense woods, narrow fire lanes, German positions on every ridgeline. The plan was always the same: attack uphill through the trees into prepared defenses. The result was always the same too: 60% casualties in the first 2 hours. Hayes had led 4 of those attacks. Everyone had failed. Everyone had left dozens of his men dead in the mud. By December, the tactical situation had gotten worse. 12 Panzer divisions had moved into defensive positions along a series of hills and ravines east of the American lines. Intelligence estimated 40,000 German troops, 300 tanks, and artillery covering every approach. The Germans had turned the terrain into a kill box. Every road was mined. Every clearing was a firing range. Every ridge was a fortress. Division wanted Hayes to attack it head-on. With 6,000 infantrymen against 12 armored divisions, Hayes knew what that meant. It meant his men were dead. All of them. Lieutenant James Kowalski was 24 years old, from Detroit, Michigan. He'd been Hayes's executive officer for 3 months. On December 9th, Kowalski led a reconnaissance patrol toward German lines to identify weak points for the coming attack. They walked into a pre-planned artillery strike at 13:40 hours. Kowalski took shrapnel through his chest and died in a crater before the medics could reach him. Hayes had known Kowalski since officer training. They'd landed on Omaha Beach together. Kowalski had a fiancée back in Detroit named Sarah who sent him letters every week. Hayes had to write her after Kowalski died. He didn't know what to say. "Your fiancée walked into artillery fire on my orders," didn't seem adequate. 3 days later, Sergeant William Chen from San Francisco led a squad-level probe toward the same German positions. Chen was 26, a Nice volunteer who'd joined despite his family being interned in California. He was trying to prove his loyalty. He made it within 200 yards of German lines before a machine gun nest opened up from a concealed position. Chen took 14 rounds across his torso. He was dead before he hit the ground. 5 other men in his squad died with him. Hayes went to recover the bodies personally. Chen's dog tags were soaked in blood. His wallet had a photo of his parents standing outside their grocery store in San Francisco, taken before the war, before the internment, before everything. That's when Hayes knew the official plan was murder. The problem was geography and German engineering. The 12 Panzer divisions weren't just sitting in open fields. They were positioned along a natural defensive line created by a series of steep ridges and a deep ravine called the Kahl River Valley. The valley was 300 feet deep in places, with near vertical slopes and exactly 2 roads crossing it. Both roads were destroyed. German engineers had blown the bridges and mined the approaches. They'd positioned anti-tank guns to cover the ruins. Anyone trying to cross would have to descend 300 feet of frozen, muddy slope while under direct fire, then climb back up the other side, with the Germans shooting down at them the entire time. It was perfect defensive terrain. The kind of ground where 12 Panzer divisions could hold off 50,000 attackers indefinitely. American casualties in the Hürtgen Forest had already exceeded 33,000 men. Most divisions were at 40% strength. The 28th Infantry had been combat effective with 14,000 troops in November. By December, they were down to 6,400. Hayes's battalion was supposed to have 900 men. He had 380 left, and division wanted him to attack straight into that kill box. Hayes had argued against it. He'd presented alternatives. He'd shown aerial reconnaissance photos proving the German positions were impregnable from the front. Division's response was simple. Orders are orders. Attack at 0600 on December 15th. Objective: secure the eastern ridge and create a breach for armored support. It was a death sentence wrapped in military terminology. Staff Sergeant David Murphy was 29, from Boston, a mechanic before the war. On December 12th, Murphy volunteered to lead another reconnaissance patrol because Hayes needed intelligence on German strength. Murphy took 8 men toward the Kaul River Valley at dawn. They made it to the western edge of the ravine before German artillery found them. The barrage lasted 4 minutes. Murphy survived the first 3, then a 105mm shell landed 6 feet from his position. The blast threw him 20 yards into a tree. His spine was broken. He died screaming for a medic who couldn't reach him through the ongoing bombardment. Hayes listened to Murphy die over the radio. Murphy's last words were asking if his men had made it out. 3 had, 5 hadn't. The pattern was clear. Every approach to German lines led through overlapping fields of fire. Every position was reinforced with mines, wire, and interlocking machine gun nests. The Germans had spent 3 months turning the Kaul River Valley into a fortress. They had ammunition, supplies, and defensive positions that American infantry couldn't crack without massive casualties. Intelligence estimated that a frontal assault would result in 70% casualties in the first hour. That meant 4,200 of Hayes's 6,000 men would be dead or wounded before they even reached German positions. The survivors would be too disorganized to exploit any breakthrough. Hayes knew this. Division knew this. Everyone knew this, but the orders stood. Attack at 600, December 15th. No alternatives. No discussion. That's when Hayes started looking at maps differently. There was another way across the Kaul River Valley, an impossible way. A way that no military planner would ever approve because it required moving 6,000 men down a near vertical slope in complete darkness and absolute silence, while German listening posts were close enough to hear a cough, but it bypassed every German defensive position. It put American forces behind the Panzer divisions. It turned the fortress into a trap. Hayes spent 3 days studying topographical maps and German patrol patterns. He interviewed every scout and forward observer who'd seen the terrain. He calculated timing, distances, and detection ranges, and he realized that if he moved his entire force in the middle of the night, using a steep game trail that German intelligence had dismissed as impassable, he could position 6,000 American infantrymen directly behind German lines by dawn. He presented the plan to division on December 13th. They rejected it immediately. Too risky, too complex, too dependent on perfect execution. One mistake, one noise, one stumble, and the entire force would be massacred in the ravine with no cover and no support. Division ordered Hayes to proceed with the frontal assault. Hayes said yes, sir, and walked out of the briefing knowing he was about to disobey a direct order. At 1800 hours on December 13th, Hayes called his company commanders together in a frozen bunker that smelled like wet wool and cordite. He had 7 officers left from the original 15. Every one of them looked exhausted. Every one of them knew what tomorrow's attack meant. Captain Thomas Reed spoke first. Reed was 27, from Atlanta, a lawyer before the war. Sir, I've run the numbers. Frontal assault against those positions means we'll lose 400 men in my company alone before we're halfway across the valley. That's everyone. I won't have a company left. Hayes nodded. He'd run the same numbers. I know. Lieutenant Paul Jackson, 25, from Chicago, looked at Hayes directly. Is there another way? Hayes pulled out a topographical map and spread it across an ammunition crate. He pointed to a thin line marking a steep descent into the Kaul River Valley 3 miles south of German positions. Game trail. Drops 280 feet in half a mile. Germans consider it impassable for large units. They don't patrol it. The officers stared at the map. Reed spoke carefully. Sir, that slope is nearly vertical in places. Moving 6,000 men down that in daylight would be hard enough. At night, in winter, in complete silence? That's impossible. It's only impossible if we get detected, Hayes said. German listening posts are positioned to monitor the roads and main approaches. This trail is 3 miles south. If we move quietly, if we control every sound, if we time it perfectly, we can get the entire battalion into the valley and across to the eastern slope before dawn. That puts us behind 12 Panzer divisions. They'll be looking west for our attack. We'll hit them from the east. Jackson studied the map. Division approved this? Division rejected it. Silence. Every officer understood what Hayes was saying. This wasn't a suggestion. This was mutiny. Reed spoke slowly. Sir, if this fails, if we're detected halfway down that slope, we'll be trapped in a ravine with no cover, and Germans firing down at us from 3 sides. It'll be a massacre, and you'll be court-martialed. Hayes met his eyes. If we follow division's orders and attack frontally tomorrow morning, 4,200 of our men will be dead by 0700 hours. I've already written the casualty reports in my head. I know their names. I know their hometowns. I'm not sending them into that. So we're doing this? Jackson asked. I'm doing this, Hayes said. Anyone who wants out can request transfer right now. No questions, no consequences. But if you stay, we move at 300 hours. Full battalion. Complete silence protocols. We'll be behind German lines by sunrise. None of the officers moved. Hayes spent the next 8 hours implementing the most detailed operation plan of his life. He couldn't brief the entire battalion without word getting back to division, so he used a cover story. They were conducting a large-scale night patrol to probe German defenses before the morning attack. But his company commanders knew the truth, and they prepared their men accordingly. Every soldier was ordered to remove identification tags and replace them with cloth strips that wouldn't clink. Every rifle sling was wrapped with cloth. Every canteen was drained or taped. Every piece of equipment that could make noise was either removed or padded. Soldiers were ordered to blacken their faces with mud. No smoking, no talking, no coughing. Hayes established a protocol. Any man who made noise would be immediately removed from the column and sent back. Harsh but necessary. One cough at the wrong moment could alert German listening posts and get everyone killed. Sergeants moved through the companies explaining the route. Single-file descent down a game trail, 280 vertical feet in darkness, across the Kaul River at a shallow ford, then up the eastern slope to positions directly behind German lines. Movement would begin at 02:20 hours. They had 4 hours to complete a march that mapmakers said was impossible. At 01:30 hours, Hayes walked the assembly area, 6,000 men standing in frozen darkness, waiting. Most of them had no idea this was an unauthorized operation. They thought it was just another night patrol. Hayes didn't correct them. Ignorance was plausible deniability if this went catastrophically wrong. At 01:45 hours, Hayes's radio operator handed him a message from division. Confirm readiness for 600 attack. December 15th, Hayes wrote back, confirmed. Conducting final reconnaissance. It wasn't technically a lie. By 0600 tomorrow, they'd either be in position behind German lines or they'd all be dead. Either way, the frontal attack wasn't happening. At 02:17 hours, Hayes gave the signal. The column started moving south into darkness, 1,000 men following one captain into the most dangerous night march of the war. The first 100 yards were easy. Flat ground, forest cover, no German positions nearby. Hayes led from the front with 2 scouts who'd reconnoitered the trail earlier. Behind him, 6,000 men moved in single file, each one maintaining contact with the man ahead by touch alone. No light, no sound, just frozen breathing and the soft crunch of boots on snow. At 0234 hours, they reached the trailhead. The descent began. Hayes went over first. The slope was exactly as steep as the maps indicated. Worse, actually. Ice covered the exposed roots and rocks. Footing was treacherous. Hayes had to brace himself against trees every few steps to avoid sliding. Behind him, the column slowed to a crawl as men navigated the descent one by one. The first crisis hit at 0241 hours. 40 men back, Private Leonard Walsh from Brooklyn lost his footing and slid 6 feet down the slope before catching himself on a tree root. His rifle clattered against rock. The sound echoed through the ravine like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Hayes stood absolutely still, listening. No response from German positions. No flares, no gunfire. Just silence and wind. After 30 seconds, Hayes signaled continue. The column started moving again. The descent took 90 minutes instead of the planned 60. The slope was worse than intelligence had suggested, and moving in complete darkness meant every step was a potential disaster. Men grabbed onto each other for stability. They used tree roots like ladder rungs. They slid controlled distances and hoped they didn't hit rocks. At 0347 hours, Hayes reached the valley floor. The Kaw River was 30 feet wide, mostly frozen, with patches of open water that looked black in the darkness. The ford was exactly where the map said it would be. A shallow crossing marked by a fallen tree on the far bank. Hayes tested the ice. It held his weight. He crossed slowly, feeling for weak spots. The ice cracked but didn't break. On the far side, he established a control point and started directing men across in small groups, 5 at a time, spread out. Weight distribution. At 0402 hours, with roughly 3,000 men across the river and 3,000 still descending the western slope, a German patrol appeared on the eastern ridge 200 yards away. Hayes saw them first. 4 silhouettes against the pre-dawn sky, walking a standard perimeter check. They were 200 yards from American positions but moving parallel to the valley, not down into it. They hadn't spotted anything yet. Hayes raised his fist. The signal rippled back through the column. Freeze. Don't move. Don't breathe. 1,000 American soldiers went absolutely still in the middle of a frozen valley. Men halfway across the river stopped mid-step. Men on the slopes grabbed trees and locked their positions. The entire column became statues. The German patrol walked closer. 180 yards, 160 yards. They were talking in German, casual conversation. One of them laughed. They suspected nothing. 40 yards. Hayes could see them clearly now. Wehrmacht infantry, regular patrol, rifles slung casually. They weren't expecting contact. They were just checking boxes before dawn. 20 yards. One of the Germans stopped and looked toward the valley. Hayes felt his heart freeze. Had they been spotted? The German said something to his companions. They all stopped. One of them raised binoculars. 100 yards. They were looking directly at American positions. Hayes calculated angles and cover. If shooting started now, in the valley with no protection, casualties would be catastrophic. But if they didn't shoot, if the Germans raised the alarm, every Panzer division in the sector would converge on this position within minutes. The German with binoculars scanned the valley slowly. He was looking at the river, at the slopes, at the trees. He was looking directly at frozen American soldiers who couldn't move without being seen. 80 yards away. Still looking. Then the German lowered his binoculars and said something that made the others laugh. They turned and continued their patrol away from the valley. They'd seen nothing. Just trees and shadows and frozen terrain that nobody would be crazy enough to cross at night. The patrol disappeared over the ridge at 0419 hours. Hayes waited 2 full minutes before giving the continue signal. Men started breathing again. The column resumed movement. That was the closest they came to detection. By 0523 hours, all 6,000 men were across the valley and climbing the eastern slope. This ascent was harder than the descent because it was steeper and they were running out of darkness. Hayes pushed the pace. They needed to reach the ridge before full sunrise, or they'd be silhouetted against the sky. At 05:47 hours, with dawn breaking in the east, Hayes crested the ridge and immediately dropped into defensive position. Below him, spread across 3 miles of fortifications, were the rear areas of 12 German panzer divisions. He was looking at supply depots, command posts, artillery parks, and maintenance areas. Tanks were parked in neat rows. Trucks were lined up for morning resupply. Officers were drinking coffee outside command tents. Nobody was looking east because there was nothing east of them except impassable terrain that the Americans couldn't possibly cross. Except the Americans had crossed it. 6,000 of them, and they were now positioned 400 yards behind German command elements with perfect fields of fire. Hayes checked his watch. 12:51 hours. Division's frontal attack was supposed to start in 9 minutes. The Germans were prepared for that. Every artillery piece, every tank, every defensive position was oriented west toward American lines. Nobody was watching the rear. Hayes positioned his battalions along a 2-mile front, directly overlooking German positions. Company commanders established fields of fire. Machine gun crews set up overlapping coverage. Mortar teams calculated ranges. By 05:58 hours, every American soldier was in position, invisible in the tree line, looking down at German forces who had no idea they were there. Hayes got on the radio. He needed to coordinate with division before this went sideways. He needed to tell them the frontal attack was cancelled, and why. But before he could transmit, German artillery opened fire at 600 hours exactly, targeting the American positions 3 miles west where Hayes's men were supposed to be. The Germans were firing at empty ground, preparing for an attack that wasn't coming. Hayes smiled. He keyed his radio and said 5 words that would end the stalemate. All units, open fire, now. At 600 hours and 15 seconds, 6,000 American rifles opened fire simultaneously from the ridgeline, pouring rounds directly into the rear areas of 12 German panzer divisions. The effect was catastrophic. German supply trucks exploded. Command tents disintegrated. Officers drinking coffee died without understanding what had happened. Artillery crews manning guns pointed west were shot from behind before they could turn around. Tank crews scrambling for their vehicles were cut down in the open. The Germans had no defensive positions facing east. No trenches, no sandbags, no cover. Their entire defensive architecture was oriented west toward expected American attacks. Hayes had turned their fortress into a shooting gallery. Within 3 minutes, German rear areas were in complete chaos. Ammunition depots were burning. Fuel trucks were exploding. Radio stations were destroyed. The entire command and control infrastructure that coordinated 12 panzer divisions was disintegrating under concentrated American fire from positions that weren't supposed to exist. Hayes walked the line, directing fire. Mortar teams, target those artillery parks. Machine guns, suppress that motor pool. Riflemen, anyone running is a target. The German response was uncoordinated and panicked. Some units tried to return fire but couldn't identify American positions in the tree line. Others tried to mount counterattacks but got caught in crossfire. Tank commanders started their engines but had no infantry support and no idea where the Americans were. At 06:15 hours, a German panzer battalion tried to reorient and attack up the ridge. 16 tanks, moving in formation, guns traversing toward American positions. Hayes called in his anti-tank teams. Bazookas fired from concealed positions. The lead tank exploded. The second tank threw a track trying to evade. The third tank took a rocket through the engine compartment and started burning. The rest of the panzer battalion broke and retreated. By 06:30 hours, the German defensive line was collapsing. With their rear areas under attack and their command structure destroyed, frontline units couldn't coordinate responses. Radio communications were down. Supply lines were cut. Artillery couldn't fire because ammunition depots were burning. Individual German units tried to mount organized resistance, but they were fighting in 2 directions: west against the American lines they'd been expecting, and east against Hayes's force that had appeared impossibly behind them. At 06:45 hours, division finally got through on Hayes's radio. The transmission was Colonel Morrison, division commander, and he sounded confused and furious. "Hayes, what the hell is going on? We're receiving reports of heavy German casualties in rear areas. Explain your situation immediately." Hayes kept his response simple. "Sir, battalion is currently engaged with enemy forces from positions east of the Kahl River Valley. We are in the rear of German defensive lines. Estimate we've destroyed 40% of enemy command infrastructure. Request immediate exploitation by armored units through the breaches we've created." Silence. Then, "How did you get east of the valley?" "Night march, sir. Unauthorized route. 6,000 men, zero detection. Complete tactical surprise." Another pause. Morrison was calculating whether to court-martial Hayes or recommend him for promotion. Finally, "Hold your positions. Armored support is moving forward. Do not, I repeat, do not withdraw until relieved. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Hayes smiled. That wasn't approval, but it wasn't a court-martial either. It was recognition that he'd just broken 12 Panzer divisions with an impossible night march and a surprise attack. By 07:20 hours, American armored units were pouring through gaps in German lines. With Hayes's force holding the eastern ridge and preventing German reinforcement, tanks drove straight through positions that had been impregnable the day before. The German defensive line that had held for 3 months crumbled in 90 minutes. German units started surrendering. Entire companies, out of ammunition and cut off from support, raised white flags. Tank crews abandoned vehicles. By 0800 hours, the battle was effectively over. 12 Panzer divisions were scattered, disorganized, and combat ineffective. The Americans had broken through, and Hayes's battalion had done it without losing a single man. At 14:30 hours on December 15th, Hayes was ordered to report to division headquarters immediately. He walked into the command tent expecting court-martial papers. Instead, he found Colonel Morrison standing over a map with 3 other senior officers, all of them studying the Kahl River Valley and Hayes's route. Morrison looked up. "Captain, explain to me how you moved 6,000 men down a near vertical slope in complete darkness without a single casualty." Hayes explained the plan. Silence protocols, controlled descent, ford timing, eastern slope positioning. He explained the risk calculations, the German patrol routes, the decision to disobey orders rather than execute a suicide attack. The officers listened without interrupting. When Hayes finished, Morrison asked one question. "How many men did you estimate we'd lose in the frontal assault?" "For 200 casualties in the first hour, sir." "That was my calculation based on German defensive positions and fields of fire." Morrison nodded. "Our staff calculated 4,400, so you disobeyed direct orders to avoid losing 70% of your force." "Yes, sir." "And instead, you conducted an unauthorized night march through terrain we'd classified as impassable. Positioned your entire force behind enemy lines without detection, and broke 12 Panzer divisions with 0 friendly casualties." "Yes, sir." Morrison stared at Hayes for a long moment. Then he said, "You're either the bravest officer I've ever met or the most insubordinate. Probably both. I should court-martial you. I should relieve you of command and send you back to the States in disgrace." Hayes said nothing. He'd known this was coming. Morrison continued, "But I won't, because you saved 4,200 American lives and broke a stalemate that's cost us 33,000 casualties over 3 months. The strategic situation has changed because of what you did. The Germans are retreating. We're advancing. That's worth more than discipline." He paused. "But you'll never do this again. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Dismissed. Hayes's night march had effects far beyond the immediate battle. The sudden collapse of German positions along the Kahl River Valley forced a general withdrawal across the entire Hürtgen Forest sector. Positions that had been impregnable for months were abandoned in days. The Germans lost the defensive line they'd spent 3 months fortifying. Strategically, the breakthrough allowed American forces to advance toward the Rhine River ahead of schedule. Divisions that had been stalled in the Hürtgen were suddenly mobile. The winter offensive that had seemed impossible in early December was underway by Christmas. Intelligence estimated that Hayes's action saved between 3,800 and 4,500 American lives by eliminating the need for the frontal assault and subsequent attritional fighting. His battalion's surprise attack destroyed approximately 60% of German command infrastructure in the sector, rendering 12 Panzer divisions combat ineffective without a major pitched battle. The night march became a case study in tactical innovation. Staff officers studied Hayes's route planning, silence protocols, and timing calculations. The operation was classified initially because it involved direct disobedience of orders, but by 1946 it was being taught at infantry schools as an example of calculated risk-taking. Hayes was quietly promoted to major in January 1945. No formal commendation, no medal, just a promotion and transfer to another division that needed experienced battalion commanders. The official record said nothing about the night march. Division didn't want to publicize that a captain had achieved better results through disobedience than generals had achieved through conventional planning. But the men who'd made that march knew. They told the story in letters home, in post-war reunions, in veterans' halls across America. They called it Hayes's Impossible March. They talked about descending frozen slopes in darkness, freezing in place while German patrols passed, opening fire at dawn on an enemy that never saw them coming. Captain Thomas Reed survived the war and returned to Atlanta. He practiced law for 40 years. When people asked about his service, he'd say, "I followed Frank Hayes through hell and came out the other side without a scratch. That's all the war story I need." Lieutenant Paul Jackson made it home to Chicago. He never talked about the war except once, at a reunion in 1967, when someone asked what combat was really like. Jackson said, "Combat is watching your captain disobey orders to save your life. That's what it's like." Hayes himself rarely discussed it. He stayed in the Army through Korea, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1956, and moved to a small town in Pennsylvania not far from where he grew up. He worked as a high school teacher. He coached baseball. He lived quietly. In 1983, a historian named Dr. Martin Crawford was researching small unit tactics in World War II when he found a footnote in division records about an unauthorized night march in December 1944. Crawford tracked down Hayes, who was 70 years old and living in Pennsylvania. They met at a diner. Crawford asked about the march. Hayes was reluctant at first, but eventually he explained the entire operation. The impossible orders, the calculated risk, the 6,000 men trusting him in darkness, the 4-hour march that changed the strategic situation. Crawford asked if Hayes ever regretted disobeying orders. Hayes thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "I regret that I had to. I wish division had listened. But if I'd followed those orders, 4,200 men would have died the next morning. I can live with being insubordinate. I couldn't live with that." Crawford spent 2 years tracking down survivors of the march. He found 47 men who'd made that descent, crossed that river, climbed that ridge. Every single one of them said the same thing. Hayes saved their lives by refusing to follow orders that would have killed them. The historian published his findings in 1985 in an academic journal called Small Unit Leadership in World War II. The article was titled Initiative Under Fire, The Hayes Night March of December 1944. It estimated that Hayes's action saved at minimum 3,800 American lives and shortened the Hürtgen Forest campaign by 3 weeks. Hayes read the article once and never discussed it publicly. He died in 1994 at age 81. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he was a decorated World War II veteran and beloved teacher. It didn't mention the night march. Most people in his town never knew. But here's what matters. That's how real leadership works in war. It's not about following orders blindly. It's not about doing what command says because that's safer for your career. It's about calculating risks, trusting your knowledge of the situation, and having the courage to disobey when obeying means sending men to die unnecessarily. Hayes saw a problem that generals couldn't or wouldn't fix. He saw a solution that seemed impossible, and he executed it perfectly because he knew the alternative was unacceptable. 1,000 men trusted him with their lives that night. Every one of them went home because Hayes was willing to risk a court-martial rather than follow a plan he knew was suicide. That's not just a war story. That's a principle. Leadership isn't about obedience. It's about responsibility. Hayes understood that the men under his command mattered more than the orders from above. He took responsibility for their lives and refused to waste them on a plan that couldn't work. The official records barely mention his name. There's no monument, no movie, no national recognition, just a few paragraphs in division records and memories from men who were there. But those 6,000 men came home. They had families, careers, lives, because one captain refused to obey an order that would have killed them. If you found this story compelling, if you believe these stories of courage and calculated risk deserve to be remembered, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected to history that matters. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you'd heard of Hayes's march before today. These aren't just stories. They're lessons. Every name matters. Every decision matters. Every act of courage against impossible odds matters. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.